Photos of the premiers in 10 and 20 years' time, they'll think I was the really old-fashioned one there. Fancy wearing a tie like that. I am delighted to be here to present at the John Cain lunch, and particularly on this topic of reform for a better Australia. I'm just going to speak for 5 or 10 minutes, and then Stuart's going to make some comments, and then we'll get into the really valuable part of Q&A. When John Cain was asked how he achieved so much reform in this state, you know, when you think about it, from freedom of information right through to liberalisation of social policy, to tobacco reform, to work cover, to the TAC, he put it down to doing much of the hard work before you actually get into government. And I know that from many personal conversations that I had with John. And certainly if you look at his history, all of that hard work paid off. Before John Cain, the Liberals were in so many ways in this state the natural party of government, but from the day John became Premier to today, Labor has governed for 32 of 43 years, which is around 75% of the time. Talking of John Cain, I did do a lecture earlier this morning at La Trobe University on public policy, and a comment came up and a reference to the late John Button. And of course, my time in federal parliament, Emma, 83 to 90, I saw a lot of John, and he was quite a mentor to me. But John always used to start every speech, every single speech, 10 people, 1,000 people, he'd always start with a gag, with a joke, and it was always a different one. But his favourite was the university lecturer who asks the student to explain the difference between ignorance and apathy. And it's the student who puts his hand up and says, Sir, I don't know and I don't care. But I do, on the public policy question, I do want to thank Emma and Per Capita, because policy development is not just for political parties, as I'll explain in a moment, and I do want to thank Per Capita for continuing the hard work of policy development today. It's really crucial. So the book is called A Better Australia, Politics, Public Policy and How to Achieve Lasting Reform, and it really looks to history to see how successful policy has been made in the past, and it addresses some of the challenges that we face in the future. And you'll be pleased to know, Stuart pointed this out to me recently, if you get on the Amazon website, it lists the top 6 best-selling economic texts in the world today, and we're in that top 6. So you can compare us to Thomas Piketty, he's on that list, but if you want to get to sleep at night, read Thomas Piketty. Ours is a much simpler read indeed. The book contains, I've got to say, my contribution to the book is not the main part of it. I did the first chapter and the last chapter, but the essence of it is really all of the interviews and the lessons that come from that through the book, and put in a very readable form. So interviews with political leaders, including Julia Gillard, Malcolm Turnbull, Cheryl Kernot, John Hewson, Ken Wyatt, Christine Mills, Steve Bracks and many more. And that's distilled into if you read the book, into a very readable narrative. I do also want to thank and acknowledge Daniel Nellor, who's here today. Daniel's over there, well known to many of you, and Daniel was my speechwriter in government and has also helped with some of the work on the book. Now, the suggestions on a way forward is really, if we don't want to go down the American path, which is really polarisation and complete lack of trust in government, we need to make politics work much better for everybody. And I'm sure I don't need to emphasise that point in this room. I mean, we all try, those of us who've been in government, we all try to make the place better. We all try to do better, to improve things. But the truth is, around the world and here in Australia, and indeed here in Victoria, the public is losing faith in the political system to address the big challenges that we've got. There's no silver bullet in the book, because there is no silver bullet. Whoever wrote up the book for readings said that its main message is, quote, positive change is complex but possible. And I think that's a good summary, very succinct, but I would add, positive change is complex but possible and necessary, or but possible and essential. That's what needs to be added. We need reform because I think, as we all know, we've got lots of big challenges, and we're going to talk about those today. We talk about some of the budgetary challenges. If you've been reading the media the last few days, AFR in particular, but Chris Richardson, very good economist, very evenly balanced, and his analysis of what's been happening with the budget at a federal level and what's been happening over the last decade on productivity is really essential reading. And it's not a criticism of any government, it's not a criticism of the current federal government, it's a criticism of particularly all federal governments over the last decade or more. And we've ended up, and again there's an add-on to Chris Richardson's analysis that was printed yesterday from the OECD today, which says that although Australia doesn't have a debt level as high as, say, the US or China or some countries in the OECD, over the last decade, debt in Australia, federal and state, has increased by 3.8 times, which is the biggest increase anywhere in the world. And so it's an issue. It's an issue as to how we manage that and how we pay for that. So those budgetary issues are pretty real, and we talk about them in the book. That's a segue really into tax, something that I've written about a lot. My book back in 2014, which was called The Long Haul, Lessons from Public Life. I did the Hamilton lecture at Melbourne Uni shortly after that. I've been, for better or for worse, one of those people who've been talking about this problem with our income tax system for a long, long time. I backed Keating's option C way back when I was just a young fellow of 30 in the federal parliament. The truth is we've got significant budget problems, and we've got over-reliance on income tax. And to the extent that we've got that massive over-reliance on income tax, they're also skewed towards young people. All right, so they're massively skewed towards young people. I still do a few lectures. As I said, I did one at La Trobe this morning. I still do quite a few at Melbourne University. I say to many of the younger people in the audience, the FBE students, if I was you, I'd be, you know, little short of a revolution, really. The system is geared against you. The personal income tax system, one thing I learned in federal parliament from people like Brian Howe and others was about effective marginal tax rates. If you look at young families today, the combination of income tax, Medicare levy, loss of family benefit, and the costs of childcare, and if you're paying off HECS, for many people they face an effective marginal tax rate of more than 85 cents in the dollar. So particularly this is a big problem still for women. It just doesn't pay to work. It just can't pay to work, notwithstanding many people want to. So we are, in general terms, not a high taxing country. This is a difficult debate for Australia. You're going to see it play out, I suspect, in the federal election, where at least one side of politics will be promising income tax cuts, I suspect. But our reliance on income taxes is really, really, really high. Our GST level is 10%, but of course we've got a lot of exemptions. The real rate is probably about 7%. The average in the OECD is 21, 22%. So this is a tricky political problem. If you walk out there as an MP, particularly a Labor MP, and say you want to put up the GST, you're probably going to be struggling to hold your seat in Parliament. But it's one of the issues that we talk about in the book, because we think if we found a way to get the moderates, if I can put it that way, in the Parliament, mainly, but maybe including the Teals as well, and you got them in a room and found a way for them all to work together, they'd all agree that we need to make reforms in this space, notwithstanding it's very, very difficult politically. So we can go on, but Danielle Wood, Productivity Commission, Danielle's fantastic. She says the degree of age segregation in the current tax system, where a retiree household on $100,000 pays half the income tax of a younger household on the same income, is neither defensible nor sustainable. By the way, just very quickly, for those of you who are interested in this subject, British Treasury did a lot of work 15 years ago on the VAT in the UK, because people say, oh, GST, it's terrible, it's regressive. It can be regressive, but it can be as progressive as you like. And when you look at the regressive part of it, there are older people who can't actually get into the workforce, and it is regressive for them unless you compensate. But the other huge cohort of people who are, quote, low income earners are students, and they're students at university. And over their lifetime, they will go on to earn substantially more than average weekly earnings. So they are poor at a point in time, they are not poor through their lifetime earning capacity. We talk about productivity in the book, the need for a new wave of national economic reform. We've had 3 of those. We had the Keating reforms, which were productivity reforms. We had the Howard Costello reforms, which were tax reforms. And when Steve and I were in government, and Kevin and Julia at national level, we had the 3rd wave of economic reform, which really Victoria created, which was about human capital. It was investment in human capital, particularly in early education, particularly in mental health, and particularly in preventative health. And it was a 3rd wave, and it built into that to many of the targets under Closing the Gap. We talk about innovation. You know, this huge issue. I was in federal parliament when Barry Jones was the Minister for Science, and Barry was inspirational, but Barry's recurring nightmare was that we would see a big lift in R&D in Australia, but none of that would translate through to commercialisation and product development. And that's continuing to occur. But ever since the Keating government in '96, Australia's spending on R&D has been declining. We're now at 1.6%. Like Israel's at 4.5%, the US is at 2.5%, the OECD's at 2.4%, China's at 2.3%. We are awful in this space. And it's a huge issue if you think about the things that are going to drive our economy in the future, the sort of industries that we need, particularly when you think of here in the Parkville precinct, tens of thousands of jobs in medical research, in therapeutics, in life sciences, and so on. So we talk about innovation in the book. We talk about health, particularly the need for more investment in preventative health. You know, spending on health keeps going up and going up. Here's a question. When Candy Broad retired from Parliament, I'll be just 2 more minutes. When Candy Broad retired from Parliament in 2010, she was cleaning out a desk, and lo and behold, actually, she found something in there which she never found when she first went in. It was an old leaflet. This is a true story from 1979, when Lindsay Thompson was Treasurer of Victoria. And it was just a leaflet, you know, the old-fashioned little leaflet. Not unexpectedly, it's Lindsay saying what a fantastic budget it was. But here's the point. It went through the budget on the biggest spending areas. So here's the question to the audience. What was by far the biggest area of state expenditure back in 1979? Peter Fitzgerald? So the answer is it was education. It was 18% of state outlays was education. Health was at about 15%. Fast forward today, the biggest spending by a long, long way. In Victoria, it's about 30 cents in the dollar. In Queensland and Tassie, it's 33 cents in the dollar. This is at state level. So this is how the world has changed. And none of that is going to go away with an ageing population and expectations of us all wanting to live longer and longer. We talk about skills and education, the continuing challenges there, despite the fact that a lot of money has gone into skills and education. 1 in 5 people in Australia still don't have the basic literacy and numeracy skills that we need. We talk about climate change. You know, we all know about climate change, but the latest IPC report says there's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for us all. In the book, so they're the problems. In the book, we suggest some changes to address this. We talk about free votes. And you've got to be careful with free votes, because we don't want to be like the US system, where just about everything's a free vote and there's 3 lobbyists to every congressperson. Right? You don't want to be like that. You don't want to be in the buy a vote category. But the truth is, some of the best debates that we've had, certainly in Victoria, when I was Premier, I introduced the reforms to abortion law, free vote, some of the best debates we ever had. The Andrews government, voluntary assisted dying, they were free votes. We need to find an opportunity. How can we squeeze some of these things in that aren't sort of necessarily defence or crucial national security issues, though it'd be good to have a debate about some of them, and aren't crucial budget issues? How do we find a way in so that we can look at things like the tax system, we can look at things like, you know, maybe negative gearing, we can look at some of these issues in a way which isn't going to run the front pages of the papers, and just to find a way through. And it's interesting, so look at the Teals. So what did the Teals got elected for all sorts of reasons, primarily the failure of the Liberal Party to address climate change, but there's a lot more than that. In a sense, the Teals have forced more free votes into the parliament. I mean, that's, if you think about it, what we needed was more opportunity for MPs to speak without the discipline of their political party. And what the Teals have done is provided, 10 or 12 of them, the opportunity they can speak freely on anything in the parliament and change votes. So they're forcing change on the system because the parliament itself hasn't adapted to what people want to get better public policy. We talk about the physical structure of parliament. They're just little things. I've been in different parliaments. I've sat across from Jeff Kennett, and in what were pretty tough and adversarial days in Parliament. We're a sword apart. I saw Paul Keating in the federal Parliament. I saw Paul destroy people in the federal Parliament. Does it make for better public policy? I'm not sure it does. The Constitutional Convention in 1988, we all spoke from a lectern like this to the left of the Speaker's chair. And so if I'm in question time and I'm a minister, I'm addressing the whole of the Parliament rather than just trying to kill my political opponent sitting opposite, because that's how it works, right? So we talk about that. And of course in the US system, and something Julia Gillard, when she launched the book for us, Julia said in the US system, in the Congress, there's no assigned seats. They're all mixed up, right? So you don't sit next to your party mates, okay, where you can roar when you're putting the dagger into someone on the other side, okay? And we say in the book too, we think this will help build friendships. You know, I'm sitting next to a Lib. I can, you know, they're a human being after all. I can talk to some of these things. I can talk to some of these things and discuss potential policies. So they're just a few of the things we go, and we talk about cooperative federalism as well. So I'm a big fan of cooperative federalism. Many of the big reforms that have been made in Australia, it's the states that have made the big reforms. You know, if you look at tobacco reform, it started here in Victoria. It was actually John Cain that first stopped the advertising. And remember the Benson and Hedges, you know, the one-day cricket? So that was very difficult to do. Transport action. So there's lots of big reforms, many of the environmental reforms. Vegetation offsets, you know, where we've created a market to save the environment. Many of those things started here in Victoria. The Grattan Institute started here as a Victorian initiative supported by the Commonwealth with then some private funding. So there are lots of things where states have led the way. So I'm a big fan of cooperative federalism, and we talk about that re-enlivening the National Cabinet and COAC. So there's some of the suggestions. I have spoken for more than my 10 minutes, which is a fault of former politicians. So I will sit down and be quiet, and I'm handing over to Emma's going to do this. So thank you.
Thank you, John. But not a word wasted, and many observations there that reflect some of the things and conversations that were had at our tax summit last month, which I'll talk about later. But now it's time to introduce one of John's co-authors, Stuart Kells. Stuart's an award-winning author whose books have been published around the world. He's adjunct professor at La Trobe University's College of Arts, Social Science and Commerce, my old school where I got my BA. He twice won the Ashurst Business Literature Prize, and his book, The Library, A Catalogue of Wonders, was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Literary Award and the New South Wales Premier's General History Prize. I also mentioned the book he wrote last year with the other co-author of this book, Scott Hamilton, Sold Down the River, which is a great read for anyone interested in public policy and in some of the more egregious international developments in our environmental policy. And Stuart is also now an Enterprise Fellow at the Melbourne Institute, just across the way here at the University of Melbourne. Please make him very welcome.
To change my glasses. Moving from my walking around glasses to my reading glasses. I hope that's okay. I'm at that stage in life. Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, John, and Per Capita, and the University and Graduate House for hosting us. I too recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners and the distinguished guests in the room. It's such a great room, a bit unnerving actually, because there's people from all sorts of different spheres of life, including from my life. So people from La Trobe, and from my friend Dennis, people from Melbourne, from government, from finance, Peter, from my Alice and Apparalista network, Rob from Abbotsford Convent, Barry Jones was mentioned earlier. Barry's been such a strong friend and supporter of my work and my writing in so many different spheres, so I acknowledge him as well. Daniel Neller has been a great friend and idea bouncer over the years as well, and a really important person in this project. So I'm going to say a few words quickly about the book, and then a few words more sort of forward-looking about this particular moment in policy. I know there's some policy students in the room as well, so hopefully it'll resonate. And I'll say a few things that are a little bit sort of provocative. Obviously Chatham House rules apply, including for people online. And the idea is to feed into our Q&A, which will come very soon after that. Great that we're holding this at the university. The university's been really supportive of this project through various different events and launches, including publishing the book as well. And we mentioned Scott, our co-author. I worked with John Brumby in various different capacities over the years when he was in government. And I just want to call out that he is a rare politician, as someone who's actually a person of substance, as well as not being a person of ego. And I found this working closely with him. He was a very inclusive sort of person. And I was in the room when John made a lot of the critical investments in innovation, including in this precinct here. Some decisive investments in the biomedical space. And in fact, what you see now in Parkville is a large part of John's legacy as a politician and as a forward-looking person. The book goes into what we thought were the sort of special ingredients, the secret sauce of public policy, and all of the usual things you'd expect to see, and that Emma and others do every day are in there. So being transparent, being impartial, being rigorous, relying on data, thinking about examples from other places, all the fundamentals which we all sort of drove home when we were working in public policy. But it also, on that foundation, goes into a few other areas about how the world has changed since those sort of 90s, when we sort of did a lot of our stuff in the early 2000s. It is a bit more sceptical of market-based approaches. Yes, markets are good in policy, but use guardrails. Exactly as Emma mentioned, in the water market, it's a good example of how that can go off the rails. Genuine and inclusive engagement in policy. We really emphasise that we don't want to have these sort of closed, ivory tower, arrogant policy processes. It's got to be inclusive. It's got to be, accessible. Can't be beige, standard neoliberal, stuff. You need to experiment. You need to engage outside. You need to involve new voices in policy making. And the way we frame that is that successful policy isn't beige and it isn't flat. It's genuinely inclusive and human and humane. And obviously with an eye to practical implementation. So robo-debt's probably a good example of how you can go off the rails if you design something that sort of sounds nice in a pressure cooker, self-referential policy context, but it doesn't really think about how it's going to play out in real world contexts with real people. Regulators, I think for a long time the vibe in regulation has been around light regulation, self-regulation, those sorts of, that sort of rhetoric. We're really sceptical of those kinds of models. Doesn't necessarily mean a bigger role for government. There are alternatives to regulation like transparency and different kinds of innovations that Rob and others have mentioned, and that's relevant for audit and those sorts of things. But if you look at case studies from aged care, child protection, superannuation, water, energy, building, banking, hands-off models, self-regulatory models, and light regulatory models don't work. So moving towards something that's a bit more consumer-centric, a bit more transparent. So that's a kind of a bit of a, laying the ground of what the book's about and where we play. couple of quick comments about this moment as provocations and as forward-looking things for our Q&A. Wow, right now, the American-led system that we've sort of taken for granted is being dismantled, on a daily basis. So just to be clear, for any Trumpists who are in the podcast or the audience, whatever we're calling it, the American-centred trade system of supply chains and outsourcing was an America First model, right? We are all part of this outsourced free trade, thing with supply chains, very important defence suppliers and others in Melbourne. That was an America First model. It was also an Australia First model. It was all in all of our interests. Dismantling that and undermining it is an America Last policy. So the rhetoric is America First, but the reality is America Last. So we're in a really important pivot point for capitalism, for the West, and for Australia. We called this out in the book before Trump was elected, that we need a systemic view of Australia and a real refresh of our economic institutions. But the thought was, if we don't act, then the lucky country, our luck will gradually run out, right? That was the hypothesis. The reality is our luck has run out, okay? So it happened much faster than we thought. Hardly anyone in government or anywhere else is taking a systemic view of all of this, right? There are some people, Andrew Leigh is one who does and has, and is a terrific thinker and writer in this space. Greg Smith is another. Greg used to run tax and revenue in the federal Treasury, and he, just a quick advertisement, he's speaking at the university on Monday at lunchtime in the Centre for Commercial Law on the Australian state in the 21st century. And Greg's work is really, really pertinent to where we are right now. So looking ahead, we're in a situation where the international order is shifting. A country like Australia, we were working on a series of working assumptions about how public policy should be created, particularly in the economic space. Those assumptions are no longer valid. We need to relook at our whole policy settings and relook at our policy institutions and our economic institutions. There's perils on multiple fronts, geopolitically, in terms of the demise of international institutions, in terms of international order and international economic relations around financial and monetary system, trade, international taxation agreements. All of those are up for grabs. We're in a new world. So briefly, what are some provocations for what it means for Australia looking forward? Again, this is to provoke a conversation. John and I might seek to get some of this published. We need to slay some sacred cows in public policy. There's some things that we've been doing for a while that turned out to be expensive follies, like how we design superannuation, how we evaluate pro-social investments, the kind of hurdle rates that we apply, those sorts of things. We need to think again about the sort of neoliberal consensus. We need to prioritise strategies like self-defence and making Australia harder to invade, and we've got a really good capability for that here. We need to strengthen our reputation as a reliable trading partner in a decentralised way. We need to look again at our technological and economic resilience in an adverse context, and that means weaning ourselves off the platforms of the US techno-state. We can recreate those here. We have the expertise to recreate those platforms that serve Australian interests as much as they serve foreign interests in areas like capital markets, social media, insurance, distribution. Let's think again about our relationships with some of those things. And just very, very quickly, an example, and Peter knows this, the international system of foreign exchange trading and settlement is not publicly owned. It's a privately owned system out of America. So the great majority of transactions when you move money around or when you trade goes through a private US-owned bank, right? So we've already got oligarchs in place, and in a non-US system, we need to think about those. So repositioning our US strategic partnership and relationship, which includes not automatically getting involved in American military ventures and adventures. Building a much stronger program of climate change adaptation, given the likelihood that global action is going to slow down. Continuing to support our China relationship as part of a global order, while building, obviously, regional partnerships and global relationships. resisting attempts from any quarter to suppress Chinese economic competition, because this is in our interests for China to thrive economically, and it's in the interests of the global south, among others. And then pursuing some really important local reforms like tax reform, as John touched on, consumer first laws, so shifting the onus onto companies to provide products and services that are in the interest of consumers, not just in the interest of business, and supporting those with legal reforms as well. Looking at capital markets at the moment, our capital market infrastructure dates from the 1970s, the sorts of legal instruments and other things, so looking again for using technology in that space. And finally, the policy refresh that we embark on needs to use all of the guidance and all the tools that we outlined in A Better Australia. So it needs to be genuinely inclusive and not beige. How's that for a provocation? Is that all right?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Again, as you can see, the book is an incredibly useful read for those of us that are determined to achieve some meaningful policy reform sooner rather than later, particularly in the area of tax and financial system, in a way that will restore opportunity for younger generations in this country. We'll open up now to a conversation. John and Stuart are happy to converse with you, take questions, have a chat. You just want to come back up here. Meredith has the microphone. So if you would like to kick us off, Peter Fitzgerald.
Can I say I love the book? It is readable and it is almost timeless, and it captures all of those initiatives over the last generation. One gap that I found in the book was we're now talking about intergenerational fairness differently, and the book talks about environment and treaty and a set of things important to intergenerational fairness. But I want to talk about HECS debt, and I'm looking at John Brumby, so you were Chancellor of La Trobe. Victorian students have about $20 billion of debt. So that's probably more than the state debt of Tasmania. Have you thought about, you John Brumby, how we would unwind this system? So back, whatever it was, 30 years ago, we thought it was a good idea. People feel it's not a great idea now. If you're a student, if you're a parent of a student, it's like, it feels like it exacerbates a set of intergenerational unfairness policies. If I look to you, John, and say, have you thought about what it means for the university and intergenerational fairness if we were to undo these policies and repay the debt from the Reserve Bank, perhaps? Perhaps we can just forgive the debt, as the Americans have thought.
So that's probably a topic for a luncheon address on its own, I think, what you do there and higher education generally and some of the challenges that are confronting higher education. For better or for worse, I was around in 87 or 88 when HECS was introduced. HECS was introduced because the higher education system at that point in time had grown considerably, but in terms of opportunity and equity, which in large part were governed by the number of available places, it was still very much, university was still very much a place for people like me, you know, the sort of traditional white middle class family. And so HECS was commenced with all of the good faith in the world by a very good Labor government to increase the number of places, particularly in underprivileged and underrepresented areas with low participation. It started at a much lower rate. I would always argue that there should be some form of HECS, some form of contribution, because the truth is, when you look at all of the data and all of the information, when somebody has a university education, there's no doubt there's some public good, but there's also significant private good. And it's not unreasonable that since there's private, it's private capital, and as you heard me say before about the work that UK Treasury did, over your lifetime, you will earn on average all other things being equal, significantly more than somebody who hasn't had the benefit of university education. So I would always argue that there needs to be a HECS in terms of good public policy, and that I think is reinforced by most analysts who would say that in equity terms it's a fair thing to do. The question is the level right? And the level question is really a question about what it costs to educate someone. So that's what it costs to run a university, what it costs to deliver a course. Are we able to make efficiencies in the way in which we're doing that? My personal view is that AI should enable efficiencies in the way in which we deliver courses. And in part, you are seeing that now through more of the private providers and some of the big industrial providers who are probably more agile than universities and who are offering short courses at significantly lower cost, but which are still valuable in the marketplace. The federal government, as you know, recently wrote off, I think it was $20 billion worth of HECS debts. There's some debate about whether that was equitable or whether it wasn't. I saw an article that it was linked to Teal and Labor seats. Well, the truth is, where the debts were written off just reflects participation rates in higher education, and in the vast outer suburban areas of Melbourne and in the regional areas, participation rates are horribly low. You know, La Trobe's got campuses in Mildura, Shepparton, Bendigo and Wodonga. In Mildura, the participation rate, that is kids from year 12 going into university education, is 15%. In Shepparton, it's about the same. In Melbourne, it's closer to 50%, right? So there are dramatic challenges. And I must say too, getting those students into education, and some of them, you know, with lower ATARs, and this is the case too in many Indigenous communities, getting them in and getting them through university is more costly than it would be, Peter, for you to get through your university course. So there's a lot of complicated issues there, but in summary, I would say I would always support a HECS. I know this is a long answer, but it's a complex issue. There are some structural issues. So, you can do a 4-year teacher training qualification, and you can start as a first-year out teacher, and in most states you'll be on about the mid-70s, high 70s. You can do your VCE in Victoria, enrol as a police recruit, start on 53,000, do 14 weeks training, and at the end of that you're a junior constable and you're on $75,000 a year. Mm-hmm. You can go into the fire brigade, ditto, and be on a similar pay scale. So, and you can, at the moment, you can work in the construction industry without many skills at all and earn a 6-figure salary. So there are some structural issues as well that are mitigating against the traditional role of universities. And I'm going to say a few things about that issue over the next few months because I think it's a critical issue for Australia. And universities are really valuable and they are really important, and the skills that they impart are really crucial. If you look at nursing, for example, so La Trobe is the 4th biggest provider of nurses, OTs and physios in Australia. All of Skills and Trade Australia says we need 79, we're going to be 79,000 nurses short by 2034, right? It's only 8 years away. We're 10,000 a year short. So it's only universities that can provide that education and that qualification and provide that status for those nurses. So there's a lot in this, but in summary, I think it is right. If somebody is getting a private benefit from the taxpayer, it is not unreasonable that they make a contribution towards the public good and the public betterment. And that's what HECS is all about.
Thanks, John. Great answer. Okay. Alison, and then we'll back to you. Just wait for the microphone so that the folk at home can hear you.
Thank you both for your words and also for your book, which I have read and gained a lot from, so thanks very much. You've given us a lot to think about. I want to pick up your comments about having a different discourse, a more civil way of developing our policy, both in Parliament and outside. And I wonder if you could think about the different arrangements we could have for different groups to come and understand an issue from different perspectives. That roughly is the point. And my second is the role of the media in promoting division, promoting conflict, promoting high emotions about these areas. And can we do anything about that? It's a big problem, as evidenced by the recent bail rules. That'd be
Yeah.
Victoria.
Can I have a quick go on that? And I won't be as
I-
long as
I
the previous
reckon
answer.
it's- I reckon
So
it's you.
the discourse, I think the discourse is really important. What in the book, and Stuart and Scott do a beautiful job of this, you know, all of the interviews, which can be a bit, you know, just as they are, a bit wordy, but they put them in language and a narrative and they tell a story, largely about how politicians got change or linked to other groups or talked in the community or learnt things from that. So I think we try and provide some models there of things that work, some examples, some case studies, but discourse is so important. We refer in the book, as I said in my remarks earlier, about the way the Parliament's structured and the way the Parliament is worked, making that more discourse friendly, if I can put it that way. Maybe it's a bit naive. The late Mick Young used to always say with Parliament, you know, I used to go back to my electorate in Bendigo on Friday and Keating will have savaged someone across the table and my voters would say, oh, Parliament was terrible. How do you put up with that? It's awful. I wish they'd stop shouting at each other. The late Mick Young would always say, if you want to be the Prime Minister of Australia or you want to be the Treasurer of Australia, the idea is you've got to be tested on the floor of the Parliament. So there needs to be a testable environment, but there needs to be more discourse as well. I agree with you. One of the things I did as Premier, I used to have what I call round tables in the Melbourne room, get 20 or 30 people in around a table. It could be on preventative health, could be on work health, could be on the bail system, whatever, getting a range of stakeholders. Because it's with the Premier and it's around the table, it was always very civilised and so on. I used to get a lot out of that, right? Like I learned so many things out of that. And some of the big initiatives that we did came out of those roundtables. So I think the discourse thing is really important. On the media, I think it's very, very challenging for the media at the moment. I mean, I said this in the lecture at La Trobe earlier this morning. I mean, if you're in the media, you won't sell a newspaper if you say, you know, John Brumby made a good speech today and everyone was happy after lunch. You maybe get a front page if there's a riot and people throw things at me and former Premier under pressure and all of that. The media's got an interest in highlighting disagreement, not agreement, right? That's the truth of the matter. So, that's why they love the bail law stuff. All the media love it, okay? Because it's a controversial issue and people have got very strong views. So the government puts a view, the media wants to report the opposite view. So I don't think you'll ever change that. It's the nature of the media. But I think there's a public policy question here. And we talk about this a bit in the book, and it goes to some of the regulation questions that Stuart talks about. Social media, you can just about do or say anything you want. You can set up a fake newspaper. I can do it with AI. I can do it for a couple of $100. It can publish all day long for me. It doesn't have to be factual. It doesn't have to be true, as long as I don't defame somebody, or if I do, as long as I don't have any money and it doesn't matter if they sue me. So I think the responsible media, and we mightn't like, the Murdoch media and things like that, but I would always prefer, if you like, a mainstream establishment media that we are able to properly regulate and put rules around, and who sign up to a charter of ethics, which is about honesty and integrity and fair reporting, than what's happening in social media, which frankly I think is just a runaway train, and which is got its benefits, but it's doing so much damage in society as well. So as much as I may disagree with some elements of the media and their ideological view, the mainstream media I think is far preferable to the alternative.
Am I wide up? Can I go in there?
No, if you want to add anything
You're
to
wider.
that
Just-
issue, or we'll
Just,
take it.
just two real quick comments. John's being a bit modest and understated about his role in the book. It wasn't just the front and the back. Very important in shaping and writing and co-authoring the middle bit as well. I would just add that in terms of engagement and new democratic models, technology can play an important role there in terms of improving the information conditions in general, and then bringing up voices, including Indigenous voices. It doesn't have to be a kind of overly technical, computer in your face sort of technology, but there are ways of using different kinds of technology to gather voices and to gather participation. So I think we need to really emphasise that.
Thank you. Public policy is a castle, but it's not built of stone. It's built of Lego, bit by bit. Right now we have a wrecking ball being flung at public policy by the name of Donald Trump. Can you please reassure us that Donald Trump is a passing phenomenon and the world will get back to rebuilding a decent public policy castle?
So, I'm not sure about that. The changes there have been pretty sort of forceful and pretty erratic. First up, Trump is doing most things he's doing are pretty consistent with what he said he would do. So in this room we don't like that, but they've got a broken democratic system, and it's the way it's designed, and it's around their constitution, and it's hard to fix. Donald Trump wouldn't get elected in Australia, right? He wouldn't get elected because of compulsory voting and preferential voting, but he can in the United States off about 28% of the voters, or whatever the figure is. So he's implementing the mandate, and I think he'll make some significant changes. The issue for us in the rest of the world is looking forward to what are other public policy settings in what may well be a different world, and I think will be a slightly different world. I think the changes that are being made are quite profound. You probably know for 30 years I've been involved with the Fred Hollows Foundation and was global chair for 10 years. I still chair a couple of their boards. One of them is the US board. We do a lot of work in Africa, which is funded by USAID, and it's mainly trachoma and cataracts. Basically all that funding has been frozen, and it's about 10-15% of our revenues that have just gone. But it's not just a money question, we just can't do the trachoma treatments. Some of the not-for-profits around the world, including some here in Australia, will probably see their revenues down by 15 or 20%. So there's a question, and again, we don't like that, and we don't think that's right, and we think it's very short-sighted, and it's a sort of a cruel thing to do to the people of the world. But we've got to find a way of working around that. Part of that's going to involve a bigger contribution, I think, from philanthropy, but particularly bigger contributions, more of the global heavyweight companies, the Googles and Metas and others, putting more into that not-for-profit space to make up for what government is not doing. But I think the other lesson that comes out of Trump is really it's central to this book. We've got to make sure that our system is working. And at the moment, the public don't think it's working. If you look at the research that's done, the Edelman research every year, they publish all this research on people's trust in the media, people's trust in politicians, people's trust in the church, and these levels have been going down and down and down. If you look at the votes of the major political parties in Australia over the last 2 decades, they've been going down and down and down. They've reached level. When John Cain won in it's either 82 or 84, one of those elections, I forget which one, he won with a primary vote of 50.1%, right? 50.1%. And so this vote of the major parties has been going down. And then that analysis after the last federal election, for every 100 kilometres you move out of Melbourne or Sydney, the vote of the major parties drops by another 10%. Then you go another 100 kilometres, another 10%. So unless we can make the system work better, we're going to find some of the same pressures, I'm sorry to say. So we need to find ways to make it work better. Sorry, that's not the answer you want to hear.
I'm going to be very restrained about what I say about Trump and America. I have a lot of different views. We definitely touch on it in the book in terms of this idea of moving away from beige processes towards ones that have a bit of colour and symbolism, and you can actually have science and real policy, but that actually still connects with people and that's actually convincing. In terms of Trump, it's not just this, but remember there was that sort of boat naming process in England where they had the election to choose the boat name, and they came up with the Boaty McBoatface. In some ways, Trump is the Boaty McBoatface candidate, where the people who voted for him, some of them are very serious, but some of them are very not serious, or they're sort of destructive or nihilistic about government, right? And so you end up with a Trump. But Trump himself and the people around him are very serious. Right? What they're planning is very serious. And so it's a real test of our system. At the moment, it's sort of within the constraints, broadly speaking, of capitalism and rule of law and more or less our norms. But at any moment, on multiple fronts, it could break out of that through the legal system, through international borders, through the military, through the international financial system and the way the monetary system works, or a couple of others as well. There's 5 or 6 breakpoints where at any particular moment we could move into a whole different reality of something that's more like a sort of neo-fascism or something, right? So we're at this sort of fork in the road moment in, reality, right? Whether we're going to end up in a sort of, it's kind of okay and we'll have a bit of a turbulent time and we'll go back to more or less some norms, or we're in a different world. And either way, Australia needs to plan for both universes, and we need to have a public policy framework and an economic system that's robust across multiple realities. And at the moment, we're not match fit for this at all.
I agree with that.
Well, on that very cheery note.
Can I make one other short
final
comment?
point.
Just one other thing, which I think, because I know there's a lot of very good minds in this room, what Stuart said before about consumer first. I've been out of politics now 15 years, and I saw it in government, but it's easy to see outside of government. I think this is a sort of a big issue. So, sort of protecting consumers, advocating for consumers, and the way government regulates is a really important thing. And I think it in part goes to the heart of, not to the heart, but it's a critical element of how people see government too. People's interaction often with government agencies and government departments. It's almost impossible to ring somebody now and get a problem fixed. You hear some horrible stories. Some of those came through in the Banking Royal Commission. More recently there's been some criticism, justified I think, of some of the super funds and how they dealt with deceased estates. But who's there to argue forcibly for the consumer? And we've got, state-based consumer affairs, and we've got ACCC and things. But I think in the modern world, they don't have the nimbleness, and they're a bit in the beige space, to go to Stuart's comment. They've got to be stronger. And Stuart and I, we're not anti-market. Anyone who knows me, I'm a big believer in markets. But the markets aren't working in a way that represents the interests of those consumers, and government's intervention is probably not decisive enough and forceful enough and nimble enough to protect those interests. So those working with agencies or water authorities or whoever it is, lots of consumers are just completely powerless. And so I think this is a really big issue about how we make government work better.
Hear, hear. And thank you very much. Please join me in thanking John Brumby and Stuart Kells. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Absolutely central to what we do at Per Capita every day. And I am going to give you a very quick recap of what's coming next out of our tax summit last month. Of course, we did use quite innovative methods to engage people over those 2 days, both in the room and online. And so we are in the process now of gathering a lot of data, a lot of footage and a lot of ideas to take that to the next stage of our policy process, in which we will be putting together a green paper on tax reform. Excellent. To be handed to the incoming government, working with organisations such as Think Forward and others that are very focused on recreating a land of opportunity for our children and grandchildren, and resolving some of those not just intergenerational inequities but intra-generational inequities that have evolved as well. So stay tuned for that. You can read all about it if you're signed up to Per Capita, which I know you all are. Next month we will be in the middle of an election campaign. We must be, because the lunch will be held 31 days before the last date the election can be held. So we know there will be an election campaign when we gather together next month. Our speaker will be Senator Jess Walsh, who's a senator here in Victoria, and she'll be talking about a lot of the work she's been doing, particularly in Gippsland, where I grew up, on the jobs and opportunities that are coming through the wind farms down there and the move to net zero. And I'm sure she'll have a lot else to say to us in the throes of a campaign as well. So that is Wednesday the 16th of April. We look forward to seeing you then, and thank you again to John and to Stuart. I do recommend you get a copy of the book. It's here. What better opportunity? Thank you, and we'll see you next month.